Hello, youth history students, and welcome to Unit 9, Lesson 2, The Reagan Revolution. By 1980, Americans are really ready for new leadership. The disaster in Vietnam, the hostage crisis in Iran, and new tensions with the Soviet Union left many of Americans feeling as though the U.S. is really losing its power in the world. Stagflation is growing worse, unemployment remains high, Johnson and Nixon made many people lose trust in the government, while Ford and Carter just provided poor leadership throughout the 1970s. So at this point, Americans are looking for a person that will instill new hope, as well as really bring the nation back to its former glory, so to speak. The 1980s see a rise of a new conservative movement known as the New Right. By this era, government-entitled programs cost $300 billion per year, and conservatives believed that civil rights had gone way too far and attacked affirmative action, which is reverse discrimination, and school busing plans. So the goals of the conservative movement, mainly the first one, shrink the size of the federal government and reduce spending. At this point, they believe that more of a hands-off government, a more laissez-faire government is what's needed, and they need to reduce spending, because if the government doesn't reduce spending, then this recession that we're in is only going to get worse. Devout Christians were disturbed by the decline of morality in the 60s and 70s. So with the rise of hippies in the 60s, the sexual revolution of the 60s and 70s, and things like that, your really devout Christians are questioning the morals of Americans. The New Right promoted school prayer and tough punishment for crimes, attacked abortion, the ERA, and homosexuality. So we're moving back from a more liberal viewpoint to a more conservative viewpoint. So they believe in promoting family values and patriotic ideals. Evangelist Jerry Falwell forms a very religious group called the Moral Majority. And the purpose of this group was to promote family values and raise money for conservative politicians. Conservatives also want increased business growth because they feel like the more businesses grow, the better for the economy and the more money that will flow back into the nation, which will then in turn get us out of the economic downturn that we're in. They want lower taxes and increased free enterprise. So they want to go back to a time when the government has little involvement in the economy. A much more laissez-faire or lazy government perspective. The New Right hopes to restore the superpower status of the United States that many Americans feel is slipping away. In 1980, conservative Republican Ronald Reagan runs for president against Jimmy Carter. Reagan runs on a platform very similar to that of the Moral Majority. He wants lower taxes, less government involvement, and family values. Reagan had previously been a Hollywood actor, governor of California, and he'd run for president in the past. But he uses Carter's failures with the economy and foreign policy by asking Americans, are you better off than you were 4 years ago? And Reagan is really the one who coins the term, Make America Great Again. And it's because of all of that that Reagan beats Carter in 1980 by a landslide. Reagan gets 90.9% of the Electoral College vote, and majority of the states within the United States vote for him. Under his less government perspective, Reagan believes the national government has grown way too big and needs to be downsized. His budget cuts include reducing Medicaid as well as welfare and job training programs because they believe at this point that that's more liberal and more big government. And if we're going to reduce the size of the government, we have to get rid of some of these welfare programs. Reagan believes in deregulation and helps stimulate businesses by reducing the power of government agencies and allowing for free enterprise to expand on its own. He also appoints 4 conservatives to the Supreme Court, including the first ever female Supreme Court Justice, Sandra Day O'Connor. When Reagan takes office in 1981, the biggest crisis facing America was stagflation in the economy. Stagflation, again, is high inflation combined with high unemployment and a stagnant or unchanging demand in a country's economy. And this is what has happened in the United States throughout the 70s. As you can see here on our map, the purple line is unemployment and the orange line is inflation. And as you can see throughout the 1970s, those 2 lines intersect and fluctuate, creating stagflation. Reagan believed in a theory called supply-side economics, or trickle-down economics. And this is a theory that if taxes are cut on the richest people in society, rich people would use their extra money to invest in the economy. But if taxes were increased, the wealthy would leave the country and invest somewhere else where tax rates are lower. And this is really what Reagan does, which is why we nickname it Reaganomics. He believes the economy was suffering in the 70s because government taxes were far too high and people didn't have enough money to spend. So in 81, Reagan urges Congress to pass a 25% tax cut over 3 years as a means of stimulating spending, increasing production, and lowering prices. Because if you cut taxes, that means more money in people's pockets. More money in people's pockets means more disposable income, which then leads to more purchases and so on and so forth. The U.S. gains 16 million new jobs, unemployment falls below 6%, and inflation declines to 4% by the mid-1980s. And this is after Reaganomics is implemented in 1983. Stagflation ends, the economy booms, and Reagan is really seen as the guy that fixed it all. In addition to downsizing the government, creating those tax cuts, Reagan also increases defense spending in order to restore America's place in the world. And defense spending means raising the amount of money the government spends on the military and ammunition and other things that are needed to defend the nation against an enemy. So if you look at our chart here, in the Vietnam War in 1968, we're spending $513 million. That dips by the 70s and goes back up in 1985 when it goes up to 556. Reagan is increasing that money to show the world America's still got it. America's still in the game. But because military spending increases, but tax revenue decreases, the government experiences a massive deficit due to Reaganomics. So taxes are how a government gets its money. When Reagan cuts taxes, he cuts the amount of money that the government is bringing in. When he increases military spending, now he's spending more money than he has that he's bringing in. This creates what we call a deficit or a lack of funds in the Reagan administration. So essentially, instead of making more money than the government's spending, it's spending more than it's making. Reagan's commitment to conservative values and cuts to social programs contribute to growing issues within the 1980s. We see a lot more school dropouts, a larger amount of homelessness throughout the nation, attacks on affirmative action, and urban and minority poverty. All of those things are increasing greatly because the government has a laissez-faire aspect on it. They're not getting involved because those kind of programs are seen as liberal. To give you a better idea of just how high school dropout rates are, for example, in 1985, the high school dropout rate is 58%. That means 58% of high school students are dropping out of high school before graduation. In 2017, the dropout rate was approximately 5.4%. So the cutting of those different programs leads to bad things happening as well. But every presidential administration has their good and their bad. The first documented cases of AIDS were reported as well in the 1980s. But the Reagan administration doesn't move very swiftly because the disease is mostly among gay men. The fact that this was seen as the gay man's disease really went against the moral majority idea because they were against homosexuality. So a lot of things that could have been done for the disease in the 80s were not done, and it ended up becoming an epidemic with millions of lives being lost. Now AIDS is a treatable condition. It's not curable, but it is treatable. And more people are able to live with the disease because of advances in medical technology. But back then, because it was seen as the gay man's disease and it went against that moral majority, not a lot was done. Reagan's commitment to conservative values and cuts to social programs contributed to even more issues when crack cocaine was introduced in the 1980s. The crack epidemic led Reagan to begin a war on drugs, and every first lady, the president's wife, has something that they're fighting on their own terms, a platform that they're using to help fix something in the country. Reagan's wife, Nancy's, was the war on drugs and Just Say No. So the reason that we have Red Ribbon Week in schools now and things of that nature is because of Nancy Reagan's Just Say No to drugs, trying to get young people to not partake of these drugs, not to get addicted so they could have a better life. Despite the social problems, Reagan was popular among voters, and by the 1984 election, he wins again. Powered by a conservative coalition of voters, many what we call Reagan Democrats voted for him, but Democrats for other offices, because Reagan is, again, a Republican. But they believed so much in what he was doing that even though they voted Democrat for the rest of the ticket, they voted for Republican Reagan. And he wins again by a 97.6 electoral college percentage. Turning from a domestic policy to a foreign policy, Reagan wants to restore the U.S. as a major world power. He really blames Carter for allowing the international prestige and influence to fall. So he's increasing that military spending. He's confronting challenges in the Middle East and in Latin America, and he is committed to winning the Cold War with the Soviet Union. One of the ways that he's going to try to raise our influence in the world again is intervening in Lebanon when violence breaks out between the Israelis and the Arabs in 1982. But anti-American hostility leads a terrorist group to seize 6 U.S. hostages in Iran in 1983. Reagan's response to this is that we do not negotiate with terrorists, which will become something that we hear quite often in our day and age. This also leads to terrorists going against the United States. In October of 1983, 2 truck bombs struck a building in Beirut, Lebanon that was housing American and French service members. The military had been there on a peacekeeping operation, the same peacekeeping operation that Reagan had initiated to ease the tensions between the Israelis and the Arabs. And this killed 307 people. 241 of them were Americans. And this truck was intentionally trying to send a message and show the distaste for Americans being there when they really didn't belong. And this led to American lives being lost. Meanwhile, in 1979, a communist group called the Sandinistas comes to power in Nicaragua. Reagan had pleaded to Congress, come on guys, we got to help them. We have to help Nicaragua fight communism. And he wants to help the Nicaraguan counter-revolutionaries called the Contras to take back power and kick the communists out, because Reagan is very, very adamant that he wants to kick out the communists. Reagan commits himself even more to fighting communism and maintaining order in Latin America. So the Reagan administration develops a plan to solve both the problem in Iran and in Nicaragua. The government illegally sells Iran weapons in exchange for the release of those 6 hostages. So we'll give you guns if you give us our people. The government then gives the money from those arms sales to the anti-communist Contras in Nicaragua to help them fight the communists that are trying to take over their government. In 1987, these illegal activities were discovered, and the IranContra affair rocked the Reagan administration. Reagan says he didn't know anything about it. And Oliver North admitted to running the operation behind the president's back. This was an interesting time. Even though the government was in the midst of a scandal, because Oliver North admitted that he did this without the president's knowledge, Reagan escaped scandal himself. And a lot of people who did believe that Reagan was in on it nicknamed him the Teflon president. Teflon being that kind of stuff that they make like cooking pans out of that nothing sticks to. Because there were some people in the United States that really feared that Reagan was in on this and that it was him that was behind it. In all of this, Reagan takes a huge stand against communism in the Soviet Union. He viewed the Soviet Union as the focus of evil in the modern world and a threat to U.S. security. He used zero option and sent 572 nuclear missiles within range of Moscow to match the USSR's ICBMs aimed at NATO nations. But his most ambitious plan was a massive, huge defense system of satellites called Strategic Defense Initiative, also nicknamed the Star Wars program. The SDI would have cost the U.S. trillions of dollars in a time frame when Reaganomics had slashed budgets for social programs. And while technically this is defense spending, Reaganomics is getting kind of a bad rap because they're spending too much money at a time when we don't have the money to spend. So while Star Wars really sounds like a great idea as far as being able to protect the United States, and the whole purpose behind this was that you would have a sophisticated satellite system that would shoot down missile attacks from other countries. Particularly at this time period, the Soviet Union was the one we were focused on. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev takes charge of the Soviet Union, and he's the leader that brings an end to the Cold War, because he begins creating moderate reforms to save Russia, because at this point, their economy is crashing pretty bad too. He comes up with two plans in particular. The first one is perestroika. The purpose of perestroika is to introduce moderate capitalism and allow some businesses and property ownership, which is a very big deal for communist nations, because under communism, you cannot own your own business. You cannot own your own property. The government owns everything. So this is a step in the direction of capitalism and free enterprise, which is what the United States has. The second one is glasnost, freedom of speech and competitive elections. The combination of these two reforms leads to a better working condition and an easing of tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, because Reagan sees a light at the end of the tunnel. In 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty, and the purpose of this treaty is to eliminate all intercontinental ballistic missiles in Europe, getting rid of basically the threat between the Soviet Union and the United States. By the late 1980s, communism was failing all across Eastern Europe. In 1989, Poland begins elections. Lithuania declares independence in March of 1990. Latvia in 1990 as well. Czechoslovakia's communist leadership is ousted in 1989. Romania's communist dictator is overthrown and executed in 1989. Bulgaria, the government pledges free elections and new constitution in 1990. And by 1991, the Soviet Union is no more. Russia and 10 former Soviet republics form Commonwealth of Independent States, and the Soviet Union is eventually dissolved. The year prior to that, the Berlin Wall is breached in November of 1989, and East and West Germany are reunited in October of 1990 after being separate for more than 40 years. In 1989, East Germans denounce communism, and the Berlin Wall finally comes down after standing for 28 years. In 1989 and 1990, Eastern European nations begin to really embrace democracy and denounce communism. These are the things that lead to the end of the Soviet Union, as well as the end of the Cold War. In 1990, states within the Soviet Union begin to break off, and they form their own democratic nations with self-determination, meaning they get to pick how they want to govern themselves. In 1991, the Soviet Union is officially dissolved, and the Cold War finally comes to an end. After 2 terms in office, Ronald Reagan cannot win again, so his vice president, George H.W. Bush, runs and wins the presidential election of 1988, and he promises to maintain Reagan's conservative policy, which really appeals to all of those voters who really loved Reagan. And while Bush does not win in as much of a landslide as Reagan did, he does get over 79% of the vote for the Electoral College. The defining event of the Bush years was the Persian Gulf War against Saddam Hussein in Iraq from 1990 to 1991. The fighting in Saudi Arabia is called Operation Desert Shield. The fighting in Kuwait is Operation Desert Storm. And U.S. involvement in this is a response to Iraq's invasion and annexation of Kuwait, which happened because of rising oil prices and production disputes. And when Saddam Hussein orders the invasion of neighboring Kuwait, other Arab nations such as Saudi Arabia and Egypt call on the United States and other Western nations to intervene and stop him. Hussein defied the United Nations Security Council demands to withdraw from Kuwait by mid-January 1991, and the Persian Gulf War begins with a massive U.S.-led offensive known as Operation Desert Storm. After 42 days of relentless attacks by the Allied coalition in the air and on the ground, President H.W. Bush declares a ceasefire on February 28th. And while this was initially considered an unqualified success for the international coalition, this simmering conflict leads to what we know of as the Iraq War that we've been in since 2003. So these tensions don't go away over the course of that decade. They really just kind of simmer. So Reagan's conservative policies and strong foreign policy really change America. He ends stagflation, restores the military, renews family values, and wins the Cold War. But his policies reduced assistance programs, ignored social problems, and tripled the national debt. So while Ronald Reagan does some really great things for the United States, he also has some bad sides, but every presidential administration does. This brings us to the end of Unit 9, Lesson 2, and I hope you have a great day.